1 Peter chapter 5. We can get the same thing from reading 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2. In verse 1, the elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. Okay, so he says, feed the flock of God, or pastor the flock of God. You can run a search on the Greek word there to confirm that if you have Strong's Concordance or some other tools to look that up with. And he says, take the oversight thereof. He tells them to take the bishopric of the church, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. Now, this is very important stuff, not because someone's forcing you to pastor and oversee the flock of God, not for filthy lucre. Don't do it for the dirty money because you're greedy and you want to make money, but do it out of a willing heart to serve other people. And in verse 3 it says, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but as ensamples to the flock. So the elders of the church should not try to be domineering lords over God's heritage. There's a great verse in Luke. It's actually, there's parallel passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it says that when James and John tried to get Jesus to make them number 2 and number 3 in the kingdom, in authority, the other disciples didn't like it, and Jesus told them that the rulers of the Gentiles lorded it over them and called themselves benefactors, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever is the least among you whoever is the greatest among you shall be the servant of all. So that's the model for any type of church leadership, whether it's the 12 apostles or whether it's the elders. It's to serve others. And Peter says, don't be a lord over the flock of God, but be examples to the flock. And that's something, a lot of the title bishop nowadays has quite an exalted sound to it. It sounds very hierarchical, very important, but in the Greek, from what I've read, the word did not have such an exalted concept associated with it in the first century, and it was a kind of just a word for a regular supervisor or someone who watches over. It's what a shepherd does. He looks at the sheep and makes sure they're okay. You stand up on the hilltop, look at the sheep, go down where they are, look at them, and make sure that they're okay and nothing's going wrong. So also you want to make sure that if someone is in a role like this, they want to make sure that they are examples, that they live out their lives in a way that leads others. Paul did the same thing. He said, follow me as I follow Christ. And if you look at Paul's interactions with people, he's not lording over other people. His approach, we see it all throughout his epistles, is he persuades other people of the truth so that they may obey it from the heart. Not because Paul says, I told you to do this. Rather, he persuades them of the truth, using logic, using reason, using the Word of God, using the Old Testament, to persuade them to do what's right, because that's what he really wants, is for people, that's what he really wanted, is for people to obey the truth from the heart because they're convinced of it. And that's a lot different from a kind of a domineering authority figure saying, do it because I say so. The carpet must be green because I say so. That's not the type of attitude that we see the New Testament teach church leaders to have. And what about another issue? How old should elders be? The word elders in English, elder has to do with being older. The Greek word presbyteros could also be translated as older men. And some people have made the argument that Paul and Barnabas appointed older men in the churches, if you translate elders that way. Also, Peter says that I'm a fellow elder when he was apparently a rather old man writing that epistle. And is there anything to the idea that elders should be older men? Well, let's take a look at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1. Rebuke not an elder, but treat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the older women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity. Honor widows that are widows indeed. It goes on to say that the widows need to be at least 60 years old. So here we have Paul saying, don't rebuke a presbyteros, don't rebuke an elder, but treat him as a father. Treat the younger men as brethren, the older women as mothers, the younger as sisters. So you've got your older men, older women, younger women. So the word older men here is elder, and the King James uses elder. Some other translations will say older men. And this chapter goes on to talk about certain older women that should be honored, and apparently financially or with material goods like food. And then it continues on, and we go down to verse 17. Let the elders that rule well be counted of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine. So we just read about honoring financially or with material ways older women, and now we're reading about honoring the elders, the presbyteros. So that's also closely related to the word for older women. A feminine form of that word is for elder women in verse 2. So, there's some indication here that the type of people that were appointed were older men. And if you look historically where the concept of elders comes from, there's no command from Jesus, appoint elders in every church. Rather, it's something that carried over from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, you have the people of Israel who are a big tribe, which is made up of lots of clans, which is made up of lots of families. And in a patriarchal society, the older men, in a situation like this, would lead the family, and the clans would be led by elders, older men, who led the clans. And the tribes of Israel had their elders, the older men in the tribes of Israel, who were honored. And since they were older, they were respected, and they were given positions of responsibility to represent the people before God, to witness transactions, and to make certain decisions for the city, to decide who could come in the gates and who couldn't, and things of that nature. So that's an Old Testament elder, and that system just carries over. As we see, it just shows up in the New Testament after it already had existed for a long time in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there were elders in every city. After the tribes of Israel moved into their tribal lands in Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, the tribe of Naphtali, they had their own cities, and you had your elders from those tribes who were serving as elders of the city wherever they happened to live. So in the New Testament, Paul says in the book of Titus, he tells him to appoint elders in every city. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders in every church, and if you look, the saints in one city would gather together, and there's a church, singular, in a city, in many cases in the New Testament, and then there's churches in a region. So each city was recognized as having its own church, singular, and in that church there were elders. So this kind of corresponds to the Old Testament city gates type elders. So here's a question: Where did the elder-pastor separation come from? You might look way back in history to the 2nd century, when many of the churches started having one bishop over the elders. Now, if you look in the New Testament, you see in the opening of Philippians, Paul greets the church with the bishops and deacons. So there's a city church, it's one church, and in that one church you have a group of bishops. So apparently he's referring to the same thing, the elders and the bishops. The verse we just talked about, Acts 20:28, calls the elders of the church bishops or overseers. So even though that soon became the practice, that is to have one bishop over the elders, if we look in the New Testament, we see that there's bishops or elders in every city church. And we don't see that distinction between bishops and elders. Now, there's a lot of tradition and fairly early history about having that distinction, but it is not in the Bible. Also, we have if you look a little later at where the Protestants got a division between pastors and elders, it's kind of a historical accident, and it's a very interesting thing to read about. I read a scholarly journal article about it several years ago, and I can't remember the name of the author, but it was very fascinating. It goes back to Geneva, Switzerland. What happened in Switzerland was in Geneva they were wanting to have a theocracy. They were wanting to have a church government that was biblical, and they also wanted to run their city, and they didn't want the pastors of the church to be in charge of all the civil affairs in the city. So they looked at some different models of doing church and city government from North Africa and Syria, and in one of these models, or in some of these models, they found that there were presbyteros, there was Greek-speaking communities, there were elders, this is the word used for elders of the church, and there were also Garusia, another word for elders, that Garusia was older men also, and these people were in charge of the civic affairs in the Christian villages or Christian communities. So what they did is they tried to do the same thing in their churches. They had men that they called pastors, and they considered them to be the Presbyterian, or I'm sorry, the presbyteros, the elders, but they call them pastor. And that's probably because the word, maybe because the word that had derived from presbyteros was used to refer to priests. I don't know German, but actually the English word for priest comes from presbyteros, but in history, that word for priest or elder came to be used for the Old Testament priest, the sacerdotal type priests in the Old Testament, the Aaronic priest. And that's not what an elder is. In the Old Testament, they were very distinct from each other.